Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. The Bible people we are looking at this week aren't usually focused on very much, and in fact, they are never even given names in the story, but that doesn't mean they are unimportant. That's especially true for our unnamed person today, Pharaoh's daughter. First, a quick review of the story. At the end of Joseph's story that we looked at yesterday, Jacob and his sons moved down to Egypt, where Joseph could care for them and their families. Over the next 400 years, their descendants grew numerous and became known as the Hebrews, and eventually they were made slaves to the Egyptians. And not long after that, the Pharaoh grew concerned that the Hebrews were so numerous that they were going to outnumber the Egyptians and perhaps threaten to take over the nation. So the Pharaoh concocted a scheme to prevent that. He commanded that all Hebrew boys that were born would have to be cast into the Nile River. Population control by drowning, you might say. Killing the male children also eliminated those who could fight as soldiers too. Well, one Hebrew woman named Jochebed didn't want that to happen to her newborn child. So she hid him as long as she could, and then put him in a basket and set him afloat in the Nile. She sent his sister Miriam to watch and see what happened. About that time, the Pharaoh's daughter went to bathe in the river, saw the basket, and saved and adopted the baby. Miriam stepped forward boldly and said that she knew someone who had given birth and who could nurse the child. And so it worked out that Moses' own mother continued to care for him and got paid for it. From that day on, Moses grew up and was educated in the royal court. Now, the first thing to note in this story is all the humor in it. As the Israelites told this story over and over, they would not have missed the many ironies throughout the story. Pharaoh's chosen instrument of destruction, the Nile River, is the very instrument of Moses' salvation. The Hebrew daughters are allowed to live, and it is those very daughters who thwart Pharaoh's plan. Moses' mother actually followed Pharaoh's command and put her baby in the Nile, with the small twist of adding the basket. It was a member of Pharaoh's own family who undermined his policies, saving the very person who would lead Israel and end his dynasty. When the princess listened to Miriam, Egyptian royalty followed a Hebrew girl's advice. Moses' mother gets paid out of Pharaoh's budget to do what she most wanted to do in the first place. Moses got educated and positioned in the royal court, setting up his ability to enter that court later and demand the Pharaoh to let God's people go. And Pharaoh's daughter gave the baby the name Moses, which means to draw out, foreshadowing that Moses would be the instrument God used to draw the Hebrew people out of slavery into freedom. All this irony is really very important. It reveals divine irony. It shows us how God so often works, using the weak and low and despised in the world to bring about God's purpose. God doesn't use power as it typically is expressed in the world. God works through people who have no obvious power. Let me explain what that means here. God's plan for the future of the Israelites rests squarely on the shoulders of a helpless baby in a fragile basket. What may be most intriguing is that much later, St. Paul saw God working in the same way in Jesus. God's plan of salvation for everyone rests on the shoulders of a helpless baby in a stable who later hangs and dies on a cross. More than just these details, Paul knew that this was the way God works, and saw that as God had done this with Moses to save God's people, Now God was doing it again in Jesus. What Paul understood was that in Jesus, it could only be God at work again. In addition, if God does work this way, then even in those situations that appear hopeless, there is opportunity for God. No matter how dark things look, there is hope. Interestingly, just as this story points forward to Jesus, so this story also points backwards to Noah. As Moses floats in his basket on the river, we can't help but think of Noah floating in the ark. The water could destroy, but it leads to life. Believe it or not, we aren't through yet. God is never mentioned in this story. The human action isn't contrived or controlled, but God works through it unobtrusively, but surely. And we can be assured that in our lives, God works like this too, bringing about God's purpose. One final thing about this story. Women play an important role here. The society of that day said that women didn't matter. Pharaoh didn't bother killing the Hebrew girls, for example. But the key means through which God's story moves forward here is through women. The Bible is very supportive of the value of women. A few years ago here at Redeemer, we had a large number of young men and women headed off to college, and their mothers formed a support group to help deal with this time in their lives. Because entrusting your child to the currents of life away from home was so similar to Moses being set adrift in the Nile River, we named the group after Jochebed, after the mother of Moses. Adrift on our own currents of life, may we be assured that God works and God saves. Thanks for watching. And remember to let this day belong to God.